And welcome once again to another edition of Footnotes. Pastor Mark here, and today I have a special guest with me in the studio. We do want you to know that if you have younger listeners with you, that the subject we're going to be talking about today is sensitive and of adult content, all done in Christian love and with good taste. But we are going to be talking about a subject that is needed and serious and something that I think we deal with more in the church than what we want to admit. My guest today is Kyle Ruth. I almost stumbled on that. Kyle Ruth, who is a licensed professional counselor. Kyle also works for the Christian counseling organization LifeWorks, which has an office in Madison, Mississippi, Starkville, Mississippi. They need counseling down there, and South Haven, Mississippi, located right across the street from us here at Broadway. And so, Kyle, we appreciate your ministry. I know that you are going to be helping us do some things here at Broadway, so we just thought it would be a great opportunity to get you in the studio and talk to you about an issue that you are very familiar with. So one of the areas of concentration that you work in, Kyle, is sexual addiction. You also work in trauma. So what I want to do today is get to know you and just kind of walk through three questions that I think would benefit our people who listen. Number one, when we say sexual addiction, what is that? And what do we mean by that? Number two, how bad is that? I mean, is that really an issue that is going on, and is it really in the church, or is this something that needs to stay private and secret, and we just need to keep our mouths shut? Number three, the question should be, okay, if it is a big deal, what can we do about it? Now, I realize that you have a practice that deals with this. One of the things we can do is always point people to you guys, but also there's probably some practical things you have for us. So, yeah. Kyle, welcome to Footnotes.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Glad to be here and glad to be a vessel, to share the things that I've been equipped with your people, your listeners, and definitely believe that God is redeeming His world through the work of His people, and He equips us all, as He talks about in Ephesians, for the equipping the saints for the work of ministry, that we may be built up, and to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, right? And,
yeah, absolutely.
So I appreciate, all different areas of the equipping process, and, feel like I've got a little bit of that could be valuable to share with you guys today.
Yeah, I certainly believe that. And so let's just kind of jump into this topic of sexual addiction. First of all, Kyle, in your professional and Christian opinion, what exactly do we mean when we say sexual addiction? Because some people might be very familiar with that. Other people might think, what in the world are you guys talking about? Yeah,
absolutely. And there's a lot of different opinions on it. Secular, faith-based, sexual sin, all this stuff, it's kind of convoluted, right? But when I think of it, it is very similar to chemical addictions. So when you think of chemical addictions, you think of relationships to a substance that are unhealthy, pathological. And the word there the words I'd like to really focus on is the relationship piece and then the unhealthy piece, right? So you think of sexual addiction, there's a relationship to sex or types of sexual behaviors, relationship that is unhealthy, right? And the person will continue to engage in despite consequences. They will grow in their need for that behavior. They will neglect other things, other relationships like God, family, work, friends. They'll build a tolerance, right? You see that in chemical addiction, is where the body needs more and more to get the same effect. You'll see that in sexual addiction. They will, although it is different, right? So, it may be more and more time spent in that addictive process. It may be different types of sexual behaviors that they engage in. If they're addicted to pornography, they may view different types of pornography to get the same type of arousal that they can no longer get from normal, healthy, godly sexual, living with their spouse.
And to be clear, when we're
Yes.
talking about sexual addiction, and I think you're making this point, but I just want to say it because there's so much confusion and perversion that is out there and so many things that are leveled against Christians. We're not talking about normal sexual intimacy in a marriage
No.
that is God ordained, that is biblical. I mean, the Bible clearly says that the man and wife become one, that is healthy, that is normal, that is expected. 1 Corinthians
Absolutely.
chapter 6, Paul says, look, your body belongs to your spouse. Your spouse's body belongs to you. You should be essentially, this is the Mark paraphrase of that passage, you should be chasing your spouse around the room at least once a week. You know, the guy who did Amanda and I's premarital counseling, Larry Ray, he's a Christian pastor here in the Memphis area, used to be on staff at Broadway. And Larry Ray told us, he said, if Mark is not chasing you around the house at least once a week, Amanda, you need to ask him why, because something's wrong. I mean, a 20-something-year-old guy who's not, seeking his wife, there are going to be issues that need to be dealt with. So we're not talking about that when we say sexual addiction.
No.
But we are talking about, and we want to differentiate, that a person could be married or unmarried who are
yes.
into these issues that we're talking about,
Yes.
sexual addiction. So an unmarried person could struggle, of course, with pornography, all kinds of different things that are out there. And even in the marriage, these things can be going on, and sometimes it's known, but it's not discussed. Sometimes it's not known, but it does create a danger to intimacy.
Absolutely. Yeah, and actually the danger really is an exchange. Instead of intimacy, the sex addict will pursue intensity, right? They'll be looking for pleasure. They'll be looking for newness. It will be very self-serving, right? And so there is often this exchange. And the problem also becomes is that, many things that the sex addict can be exposed to will provide a type of intensity that is not really natural, in a marriage, right? It takes from something that should be good and God ordained. I mean, God spoke everything into existence, and He created our bodies. He designed them, and they are designed with parts that are pleasurable when they're touched, right? The sex addict will use that and will look for intense experiences because they don't have oftentimes intimate experiences. They don't have true bonding. And when you look at a lot of addicts, chemical or process addiction, that's a compulsive behavior that someone will repeat time and time again. So, same category as gambling or gaming, right? It's behavioral, and they will engage in whatever they can find to give themselves that fix. But here's the thing: they're not happy, right? I mean, what they're doing, they're artificially creating a solution to a bonding problem. Patrick Carnes, who basically wrote the curriculum on sexual addiction therapy, he said all addiction is an intimacy disorder. So intimacy is out of line, and whether it's created in childhood with the bonding between parent and child, or in adolescence between peer to peer, when intimacy is not in order, the body feels it, and it wants to correct the problem. So addicts, I mean, they're not bad people. They have a problem just like you and I. They just found a solution to their problem that is causing more destruction, right? And they'll continue it despite negative consequences. Their lives may fall apart, right? And biblically, I mean, God disciplines those He loves, right? So, the feeling of guilt and discipline for those behaviors, I think, is a way that God intervenes to change and to correct those behaviors. And for those that are listening, they'll adjust their behaviors, right? That didn't work for me. I got a bad solution to that when I tried this thing. But for the sex addict or alcoholic, I mean, they'll continue the same pattern despite the negative consequence.
So just to differentiate, because again, our first question, what is sexual addiction?
Sure.
I'm trying to distinguish. This isn't just normal marriage problems, but let's go a little bit further. I mean, what you're describing is very habitual behavior, but excessive. So help us understand as we listen. Let's say there's a guy who's listening to this, and I'm just going to pick on guys. I'm not saying it can't happen to females, but I'm a man, and I understand some level of this. Let's say that there's a guy who, is struggling looking at the computer that he shouldn't be looking at once or twice a week. Now, would you say, okay, that's sexual addiction, or are you going further to like the Jeffrey Dahmer phase where you're saying, no, I'm talking about people who are like a raging drunk?
Right.
So does that make sense?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I think probably the majority of the people listening to this in their families, in their homes, maybe with their teenagers, they're maybe dealing with things in the digital age, with phones and internet and all these Snapchats and TikToks. And, they're looking at all this and they're saying, okay, now wait, are we talking about everybody that struggles with pornography or struggles with sexual pleasure in some respect? Or are we talking about something major?
Yeah.
So kind of help differentiate that.
Yeah, I'd actually put it probably in the middle, right? I mean, just because there may be sexual sin in someone's life, it doesn't qualify them as a sex addict, right? So that the teenager, right, who is exposed to pornography and has his arousal centers turned on by it because that's what he's designed to do. And he goes to church on Sunday morning and he's convicted of it. He knows it's a wrong behavior, but because at times the church doesn't do a very good job of, addressing those issues, he might feel shame and he might hide that behavior. That is not what we're talking about here, right? That will happen, right? Or even in marriage, right? There's sexual sin in marriage, and it is, it exists. Is it sexual addiction every time it happens? The answer, I think, is no, right? So it is. What addiction really does, it changes the way the brain thinks, and it makes something about survival, right? So it basically hijacks the bottom part of your brain and says, I need more and more of this to live, right? So the teenager, and it can be male or female, like you did indicate, that struggles with it, but isn't feeding off of it as it's sure like life source, may have a problem with sexual sin, but I would not categorize that kid as an addict. And even more so, so I worked at Capstone Treatment Center. It was a treatment center for adolescent boys, ages 15 to 25, and we didn't call any of our boys addicts. And part of that is just because the brain chemistry of it, the part of the brain that's involved in addiction, isn't fully developed until you're about 25 years old. So a lot of changing can go on, and though they may have addictive processes, their brain chemistry was not yet set into the addictive mode, right? So we saw that as a positive thing, and I mean, just as quickly as they develop some unwanted behaviors, they can actually revert back to more godly wanted ones. But it was as their brain also changed, right? It developed new neuropathways that said, hey, I can handle hard things without acting out. This is a hard emotion, and I don't have to numb this. I can feel this. I can process it instead of numb it. I can engage relationally with people instead of fantasy, right? But it is a process of change.
And the reason I bring that up is because people listening to this might think, okay, I know I have a teenager who's dealing with something, or, I'm a husband that's dealing with something, and I just want to differentiate because I don't think we're labeling every sexual sin sexual addiction. There's a big difference.
That is correct.
Very big difference. Now, sexual sin is wrong.
Yes.
And just very quickly, since we've differentiated and we're still under what is sexual addiction, we would say not all sexual sin is addiction, so we don't want to rush to that conclusion. What would be some simple things that anybody struggling with sexual sin could try to do to curve that? You've mentioned some of these adolescents, as they grew up and their brain developed, they were able to differentiate and, like you said, handle, right? I love how you said you don't have to go to fantasy.
Yep.
I once heard Nancy Lee DeMoss, I believe it was her, she said that the greatest sexual organ in the human body is the brain. And the brain, will get you into fantasy and unrealistic situations. And a lot of people go there to escape. It's an escape, a mental escape. So if a person is in that, whatever age they are, what are some things that you would say, because I'm assuming people come to you. Do people ever come to you and you have to say, yeah, you're not a sexual addict?
Absolutely.
You're just dealing with sexual sin.
Yes, and actually a lot of believers, believe it or not.
They come to you with that.
Yes, just because, the Scripture is clear about sexual sin and fleeing from sexual immorality. And for conservative people, right, that are trying to mortify the sin in their life, they see it as what it is. It is a problem, right? And they will label it themselves as addictive, right? Even as, someone might say, I'm addicted to Doritos, right? Or, Pringles, once you pop, you can't stop. But if I'm thinking clinically, they are two different things, and there is a process of helping people to see that. On the other hand, sometimes it's not super helpful, right? There may be people struggling, and they have put some labels on themselves that are actually helping them in their sanctifying process. They're labeling it, farther down the spectrum than maybe I would, but it's helping them to cope with their behavior, and they're actually changing their behavior and becoming happier people, more whole people, right? So, if it's label based, for some that may be harmful, for others it may be helpful. But no, I won't jump to conclusions that sexual sin in every form is sexual addiction. I stay very far away from that, actually, right? If you're talking sexual addiction, you're talking about, therapy, you're talking about potential residential treatment, you're talking about a long-term healing process that's multifaceted, right? It's incorporating the body, the mind, the soul, right, of the person, and if you're talking about sexual sin, I'm thinking more, okay, let's get some discipleship in your life. Let's get some mentorship. Let's put you in contact with older folks in the church that can normalize what you're going through right now. Because I think a lot of times, our bodies are going to develop, right? And, we hit adolescence, we hit puberty, and our sexual organs, they go wild. Our hormones go wild. And if we don't have a teacher that knows what's going on, we may fall into, there's something wrong with me. And that's not wrong at all. Your body's just developing how God chose it to develop, going from childhood to adulthood, right? So in those situations, I would just encourage parents, to have honest conversations with their kids early and often, right? At Capstone, our average age of first exposure to pornography for the boys that went to residential treatment was about 8 years old.
8 years old.
8 years old.
And is that because of the advent of cell phones and the interweb and everything in between?
Yes. Right. I think that propagated that issue much more than,
Well, and I think about when I was a boy, the only way to find pornography was you had to know someone who had access to a magazine.
Yes.
So you didn't have it on your phone.
That's right.
So if somebody in the neighborhood had a dad or a brother who had access to that, then that could be passed around. But, it was always rare. It was very rare and hard to find.
That's right.
But now it's right at everybody's fingertip.
Yes.
And are we seeing more sexual addiction develop because of the advent of all this technology?
I would have to say so. The CSAT training, the sexual addiction training for therapists, it talks about the three-legged stool, right? And one is affordability. You don't have to pay for this stuff.
It's free.
It's free.
Because they can throw ads and everything else and make money off you just visiting.
That's right.
Okay.
One is it's anonymous.
Anonymous,
right?
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't have to walk to a local sex shop to get, sexual content.
Or go to a Circle K.
Or a Circle K.
And say, hey, could I see what's behind the counter?
That's right.
Yeah, right. Okay, anonymous, and then...
And the last one is that, we have it.
It's available.
It's available, right? So, Mark, you got a smartphone?
Yes, it's right here on the table.
Yes, it's available.
Yeah.
Right. So with the advent of that, right, availability, affordability, and anonymous all became bigger factors, right? And also, when you talk about going to a friend's house whose dad had magazine, the content in that magazine was the content in that magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
That phone right there that's sitting on the table is a black hole.
Yeah, that's right.
And when you think about, once again, going back to the needing more and more of the substance, right, to create the same high, right, that phone gives it. And just like YouTube, right, suggested videos, right? Let me take you a little farther down the rabbit hole, right? So there's hooks built into the structures, especially around pornography addiction, right? And then if you're not careful, the pornography doesn't work anymore, and people will search out real life experiences that resemble the things they've seen, right? And that's another level of just pleasure seeking that, my body doesn't respond anymore to what it used to respond to. It's moving away from the natural order and it's creating this fantasy kind of outplay where I'm going to more and more intense.
The law of diminishing returns.
That's right. That's right.
So, yeah. Now, right now, I have not watched this, but I keep hearing about it. This Dahmer TV show, Jeffrey Dahmer. I do know that over 25 years ago, Dr. James Dobson interviewed Jeffrey Dahmer on his death bed, so to speak. I realize he didn't die in a bed, but right before he was executed. And Dobson records part of the interview in his book, Life on the Edge, which is a really good book. It was one of my favorite books in college. It was given to me as a graduation gift. And I just have always cherished that book by James Dobson, Life on the Edge. But in Life on the Edge, he talks about that interview with Dahmer. Most people don't know this, and I'm pretty sure the television network that produced Dahmer will not talk about this. But he professed Christ at the end of his life, according to Dobson. Dobson went down. They let him go into the facility. He interviewed him in Florida, where Dahmer was at. And when Dobson asked him, what led you to this? Dahmer stated that it started with a Sears Roebuck catalog. Now, for those of us that are older, in the old days, you had the catalog, and there was a section of bras and women's undergarment apparel. Yeah. And so Dahmer says to Dobson that he started there. And then he went into pornography. And just what you're saying, that law of diminishing returns, he continued down that path. And what was satisfying him yesterday would not do it today. So he kept going further and further down the rabbit hole. He went into homosexuality in his pornography. He went into bestiality. And then eventually he starts going to women and mutilating them and eating them and, you know, doing all these grotesque things to their bodies while they're dead because he's been led down this black hole. Now, I think about that. And that was 25 years ago, before the advent of the internet. How many more Dahmers will be out there because of the black hole of our phone that we have in front of us? And they are being led down. And why are we seeing an increase in transgenderism, all these different things that your grandparents would say, we didn't see that in our day? Well, you know, the progressives will tell you, well, the reason you didn't see it is because you oppressed it. You know, it was always there. Maybe some of that. I mean, Liberace was in the 50s. I mean, maybe some of that. But I think a lot of it is the advent of pornography because, you know, again, normal sexual intimacy is not what drives this. Now, I have not seen pornography in multiple decades. I have seen it in my life. I mean, I'm going to say that because it's true. If that offends anybody, when I was young, I mean, I saw magazines passed around in the neighborhood. You know, all that. It was wrong. It was a sin. But, you know, what I've been told, and I don't know this firsthand, but what I've been told is that what's out there now, some guy who was with law enforcement told me you can get anything now. If you can imagine it, any kind of perversion, they have websites for that. And it's conquest. It's like, it's not intimacy, it's conquest sexual encounters. So you're having mutilations, you're having, you know, almost like rape.
Yes.
And people are watching this and being stimulated by this, and it's turning the culture extremely dark.
Yeah. Yes. And you know, just to say, I mean, not every, you know, one of these teenagers that enter into this black hole are going to get there, right?
Right. And I'm not implying that, but it's there.
It does exist, right? And there is an increase in you know, violence as a theme, right? And a buddy of mine who's at Red River Counseling down in Jackson, Mississippi, he wrote an article, and he called it de-anthro pornography, right?
De-anthro pornography.
I think that's the term he used, right? But
right.
It's taking away the humanity from people, right? Because of the blend between the violent act and the pleasurable one, right? The people are becoming more of an object, right, than a soul, right? And yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue, right? I mean, even me as a believer, look at, all of humankind, we're made in the image of God, right? And if I have messaging in my life that is telling me that, someone's not human or someone can be used for my pleasure, there's a major problem with that, right? And so, I mean, for parents, I mean, we want to, talk to them and encourage them to be just upfront with their kids, and talk to their kids, and
and that's important, and I think you're giving us sound advice to all parents early. Talk about it.
Yes.
Just briefly, let's be honest. I mean, when I was growing up in church, you didn't talk about this.
No, that's right.
You went blind, and only really bad sinners did that.
That's right.
And so nobody admitted it.
Yep.
And so there was never really a discussion about that. And so when, I guess the culture, the church just really didn't keep up. And I think there's still this shame. We don't want to talk about that with our kids. We don't want to admit that. But you're saying, look, if you don't, they're seeing it at 8 years old. Somebody's going to show them something somewhere. We've got to speak to our children about this.
That's right.
And not be afraid. And it's not damaging.
No. I mean, so the culture will teach your kids if you don't, right? My biblical theology professor at RTS, Reformed Theological Seminary, he did a biblical theology on marriage. So tracking the themes of marriage throughout Scripture, and he said, marriage is supposed to be white hot and rock solid. And he said, our churches know what to do with rock solid, right? They'll talk about commitment all day long, right? But they don't know what to do with passion, and so they leave it out of the equation. And he said, our culture is the opposite way. They'll talk about the passion, going back to what we were talking about before, the intensity, right? But there's no commitment in it. Right, it's all about you. It's all about your biggest, thrill that you can find, and we want to have and equip ourselves as adults and married men and women and our children to understand that, it's both, right? I tell parents all the time, we need to teach our kids how to live faithfully in a fallen world instead of just pretending like it's not fallen. Right, so if we're not talking about this stuff and we're living in a place that's going to hurt us, your kids are going to get it at the lunchroom table, right? They're going to get it. They're going to stumble across it, on their devices. And if they don't have a voice in their life to help them sort that out, they're going to be on their own. And quite honestly, their brains are not ready for it. 8 years old is not... the developmental age where kids are ready to process what sex means. And so what they'll do, and there's a term, in the sexual addiction is reenactment, right? What they'll do, they'll continue to go to the same source. They'll continue to try to figure out what's going on that they've seen through behaviors. They'll play it out. Sometimes, it will be played out with another child, right? And it's their way of processing it, right? And, I like to stop here and also tell parents this is what kids do naturally. I was meeting with a guy, in Arkansas, and I was trying to explain this to him, and he said, Kyle, I remember when JFK was shot as a kid. And I remember everybody crowded around the TV, And so I knew something was important, but I didn't know what was going on. And he said, for weeks afterwards, I took my wagon, I put a box on it, I put a blanket over it, I tied a rope around it, I put on my church clothes, and I walked it around. Right? What he was doing, he was playing out the funeral procession. Right? And, he was trying in his little brain to make sense of something that the world was telling him was really, really important. Right? So we do that all the time. And, my encouragement then is to have people in your life, or, invest in your children's lives where you can help them understand hard things so they don't have to process it by themselves. Right? Because that goes right back to, that all addiction is an intimacy disorder. If there's a part of me that is unknown, that no one's going to speak into, right, that I'm actually losing a sense of intimacy with you. And shame is going to start to fill my life as I internalize things. I'm going to think I'm bad. I'm going to think that, there's something wrong with me, right? I'm going to try to quit, and I'm not going to be able to, right? Which will drive it further and further underground. And that's the addictive process in the making, right? Still not there yet, right? Because once again, I wouldn't call, a 14-year-old an addict. The brain is still maturing, it's still growing, it's still forming. But the process is moving.
So let's talk to parents very quickly, because we've just differentiated what is sexual addiction, what is it not so far. Still under number one. So if parents are going to talk to their kids, because I know parents are going to listen to this and say, okay, well, how do we do this? Like, I think about my sons in particular. We've had some discussions, but, one of my sons is at an age where he doesn't really even want to talk to dad really about anything. He's like, Dad, everything's Dad, no matter what I say. If I say, oh, you look so nice today, Dad, oh, you did so great out there on the field, Dad, and they just, they're embarrassed by everything.
Right.
So you want to have those conversations, but it depends on also their season of life. So, what advice would you give to a parent? Because a lot of parents are going to run out and go, okay, I need to talk to my kid. How do I do that?
Yeah.
What do I do? What do I say?
Yeah.
How raw would you suggest a parent gets?
It depends on the age and the maturity of the child. Right. I think if, our average age was age 8, right? And so for those kids, it would have been really nice to have, in that file in their brain, I can talk to mom or dad about this, right? So I say early and often, it's age specific, and as they get older, it becomes not just the warnings of what could be, but you have more specific conversations too. They're going to have questions. Right. Their bodies are going to be changing. So
you've got to create the environment where at least you tell them, I'm here if you want to ask me anything. Something, though, it's not, to me, this is something I've discovered. It's not just saying, I'm here. You've also got to be prepared as a parent to not freak out if they tell you something. If they say, well, listen, I just want you to know that I did this, or I went there, or this happened, you can't go, oh my gosh, what do you mean you did that? You can't freak out. If you do, they're never going to talk to you again.
That's right.
And there's a temptation for parents to do that. I remember one time when one of my boys was little. He heard from a friend at school a very bad curse word, and he did not know what it meant. He had never heard the word. And we're sitting in the floor playing one night in their bedroom, and my little boy, probably 5 years old, says, "Daddy, what does blank mean?" And his mother happened to be walking by, and she heard it and went ballistic. I mean, oh my gosh, where did you hear that? What, and it freaked him out. He didn't know. And I had to, tell her, all right, Mom, back off.
Yep.
Let me just deal with this. I mean, there was a little bit of shock. This just shows my horrible sin nature. There was a little bit of an, oh my goodness, you couldn't believe in such innocence this word was said. And I had to say, well, son, that's a very good question. And, I want you to always feel like you can come and talk to me about those words. But almost the other reaction was like, let's just instantly punish him. Don't ever say that word again. If I hear you say that again, you're going to get grounded. And he doesn't know,
That's right.
So sometimes when our kids are going to come to us at 9, 10, 11 years old, maybe even 14, we've got to be strong enough to deal with that. To give you another example, I had this wonderful family in our church in Texas, and we were talking about this in a parenting class. And this particular mother who had an 18-year-old boy, the subject we were talking about, she said, well, I'm just here to tell you, my son has never done that. Now, I just thought to myself, boy, you're naive. But I didn't say that. I let it go. And I said, really, do you think? Oh, I know. He tells me everything. He's never done that. Well, years later, when her son grew up, got married and all that, I was discipling him. And we had this conversation and a pretty good laugh about it, too, because he brought it up. And he said when he was younger, he was struggling with that particular thing. And I said, really? He said, yes, I struggled with it for years in high school. And I said, well, you're never going to believe this. Your mother did not think you dealt with that. And he goes, oh, yeah, I dealt with that, but I wasn't telling her that.
That's right.
And so there's this naivety sometimes, too, where we just think, oh, no, my kid doesn't do that. Yep. Are you kidding me?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that, once again, we got to help our kids understand all the experiences that we have as human beings, right? We've got to help them understand what pain is, right? I mean, if they don't see pain in their dad, what are they going to do when they start feeling pain themselves? They're going to internalize it, right? I don't know if he can relate to this. And there's actually a good book on this. Dr. Dan Siegel, he wrote a book called Parenting from the Inside Out. And it's about attuning to your child and understanding their world, sitting with them in their world, understanding where they're at. It's the same in every scenario, right? But they are going to be exposed to sexual things because that's who they are. It's important for us to have, a voice in that conversation.
So that very good. So when we talk about what is sexual addiction, I feel like we've covered that pretty extensively, talked through it. Let's now move to the second question. How bad is it? Now, I think we've touched on this a little bit with the advent of the phone, but maybe there's people listening to this going, you really shouldn't be talking about this.
Sure.
How bad is this?
Yeah, it's all over the place. And once again, I mean, let's put it like this, right? For some, it's compulsion, right? They have a compulsion to repeat sexual behaviors. Are they sex addicts? Not quite yet, maybe, right? But there's unwanted behaviors that they continue to engage in that are unwanted, right? This is male and female. This is old and young. This is single and married, right? It's across the culture, right? It's churched and unchurched. So I think that, top to bottom, I see this a lot. I see marriages coming through my doors and, one of the biggest complaints, right? I mean, whether it's an affair or it is, pornography, that started as a teenager, right? Hear those stories a lot. I hear working with the boys at Capstone. I don't know if I could say 100%, right? But, at the clinical, the residential level, for those kids, there was sexual trauma, right? Whether it's based off exposure or experience, right? I would say it's a big issue, and one of the reasons why is just that so many good people are quiet, and actually, the organization that did a lot of my sexual addiction training, they also have a pathway for pastors to become, they call them pastoral sexual addiction professionals, right? To do triage with their congregation, to recognize, the presence of these things. Because in actuality, we're created body and soul, right? And, when you look at the treatment of this, in practice, it doesn't really equate to a pray it away kind of approach, right? It's more of a work out your salvation with fear and trembling, right? And get to work and get support and those sorts of things, and have people in your life that are going to encourage you and hold you accountable, and create community around it to decrease the shame and increase, true felt relationship. But yes, very, I'd say very pervasive. And, the more and more, it is a male and female thing. So if you have daughters at home, right, have these conversations. One book that I've looked at recently did a lot of interviews with the pornography industry, and
the book did interviews.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And one of the things they reported.
What is the name of the book?
Is called Pornland.
Pornland.
Yes, and I'm not sure I would
Google it. Don't Google it. Yeah,
it definitely has some explicit. It's not a faith-based book, but
okay, so not a Christian book.
Not a Christian book, but it has, good insight on, the industry of pornography and why it's so addictive, and intentionally so, to make more money. But one of the things that they said was that young girls coming into the industry were not having to be taught how to act in pornography anymore. They already knew, right? Because they had been exposed to it early on. They had seen it. They had developed an idea around sexuality that was influenced by pornography. And so they were already ready for it. And that's a super sad statement, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're seeing sexual trafficking now, and that's a big thing. Politicians are talking about it.
Yeah.
Concerts are talking about it. Christian organizations are talking about it. And you're going, why? What's happening? When did all this trafficking come through? Is it because we don't have a wall at the border? No, it doesn't have anything to do with that. It's because pornography is such big business, and people are wanting more and more and more. And now, we're having discussions with our kids. We don't want them walking from our house to the church. It's like, a football field's length. We don't want them walking across the road because it's dangerous. What if somebody tries to pick you up?
Yeah, that's right.
And our neighborhood has actually had an issue with that. And the South Haven Police Department got involved.
Wow.
Yeah. Somebody was driving through the neighborhood, rolling down the window, talking to kids.
Yeah. It's sad.
Yeah.
Right. And that's that deconstructing of what it is to be human and to be made in God's image, and instead, you're objectified, right? So sad deal. And it is. It's all around us.
And so, how bad is it? The answer is it's a pandemic.
It's a pandemic.
It's a pandemic. So anyone who says you shouldn't be talking about this, your head is in the sand. Yeah. That's to be fair.
Yeah.
That's a professional opinion.
Yeah. Yes.
That's
Now,
your professional opinion. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and listen, I mean, people might think it's less than just because people don't talk about it, right? Or in your circle, they don't talk about it. There's a lot of shame in the church around, sexual sin. So what do we do with that? Do we confess our sins and he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and purify us? No, we don't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's not a lot of sharing about it. And the truth is that the process of healing comes through sharing, right? It comes through understanding your story, right? And I look at people that walk through my office door as people with a story, right? They're not just their behavior. And when you can see people like that, you can give them some hope, right? They'll begin to break down the walls that have that they've constructed to keep people out, and then feel good in other ways, numb in other ways, fantasize in other ways, and they start to have real relationship with people. And that's really the medicine, All addiction is an intimacy disorder.
So thirdly, Kyle, let's answer the question. So we know what it is. We know how bad it is. So what do we do? What do we do? What do we do as Christians? What do we do as parents? What do we do as men, women, boys, girls, you name it? What do we do? How do we fight this? I mean, we know we have people like you that's a licensed, practical, professional counselor.
Yeah.
You've majored in this, and there's organizations like LifeWorks that will help people. But what can we do? Other than that?
I think churches, create a culture where people are accepted as they are, right? Where you can look past, their behavior, right? You can love them for who they are. There's actually a TED Talk that I saw, and the guy was looking at chemical addiction, but going around the world and asking questions about what makes an addict, right? And he references this study that was done back in the 80s, I think, called Rat Park. And in this study, there's a rat. He's put in a cage, and in this cage there are 2 water bottles, right? One of the water bottles is water, and one of them is laced with heroin, right? And you could probably guess what happened, right? The rat would try both, and then he would get hooked on the heroin water until he died, right? I mean, and it happened time and time again. And so they created this narrative around addiction that said, hey, if you try this, right, that's the end of the story. But then another group came along and they said, well, there's something wrong with this, right? If I was in a cage by myself, I'd probably choose the heroin water too, right? But what they did, they created a rat park. And in the rat park were other rats. There was the exercise wheels, there was food, there was warmth, there was all the things needed for a rat to exist. And can you guess what happened?
The rats fed off the encouragement of each other? I don't know. That's just a guess. Or they bonded together or something of that nature?
They would try both water bottles.
Oh.
But they would prefer the real water.
When they had community.
Wow. Right. And so his conclusion is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Right. So when you look at, addiction as an intimacy disorder, and you're asking what we can do to help, it's about creating connection with your kids, with your friends, with your coworkers. If you're struggling, it's about, taking that step of faith and, opening up to trusted people, right, and creating community. that needs a lot of encouragement, especially when some people don't know what to do with it, right? And are repulsed, or they want to run for the door. What we need to do is change that culture, right? We need to give sinners a place to come, right, and be accepted, right? And really, that's what Christ does for us, right?
Yeah, there definitely needs to be that community and that openness. And so what a plug for community groups, discipleship groups, Sunday school, being in church. I mean, all of those things, you have a community that surrounds you and helps you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then, if you're the one struggling and you need help in getting to that place, right? See a counselor, right? I mean,
right. And see your pastors. I mean, step one, your pastors would love to help you. Yeah. I do some counseling. People will come and say, "Hey, could you premarital counsel, or could you talk to us about this particular issue?" Of course, we're happy to be a step. And then if it needs to be more, you go, and we have places like Kyle Ruth at LifeWorks. And we can say, look, I could refer you to Kyle. I think he would help you. And that's not a bad thing either. I'm thankful that you guys exist, because all we would do is counseling. There's some cases, and this, where you can help people in a couple of sessions, maybe even 8 weeks. But there's some that are going to need 6 months to a year, if not longer. And you just don't have, a pastor doesn't have the time to be able to give all of that to one person. There's no way. Yep. There's too many other things. Yep. I mean, I know on my desk every day there's 6 things we got to do to keep the building up that you need to take to the finance people. And then there's, all these events that we've planned that are going on. And then there's discipleship, and there's leading the staff. And then you got to study somewhere in there for all these studies you're doing and all these sermons. And then there's counseling. And it's like there's only so much of a day that goes around. So there's got to be other people that'll help. And I'm thankful for you guys and that you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
And just to note this, I'm sure we said this earlier, but I mean, you're a Christian counselor.
Yes.
So you are a believer. You are a member of a local church.
That's correct.
You are at a heathen that I know, Mike Weinbibber's church. I mean, Weinbrenner. Oh, I'm so sorry. Mike Weinbrenner. No, he's an old friend. I've known Mike for a long time. And you go to, in Horn Lake, what is the name of the church?
Christ Fellowship.
Christ Fellowship, which great people over there. We have some North Point, a coach goes over there, Ethan McClure. Good people that attend there. And so you're a member, and you're Mike Weinbrenner's brother-in-law. So let's be fair. All right. Yes. Let's. I'm just kind of kidding about his name, but you're a believer, and so the counseling that you do, you've been trained.
Yes.
But you also believe in the authority of Scripture.
That's right.
So when we send people to you, they're getting counseling, but they're getting Christian counseling. And I just want to note this as well, because I think some people might listen to this podcast and go, well, how do I get in touch with that guy? That's so right. If somebody wanted to reach out anonymously to you, is it like lifeworks.com or
.ms?
.ms, Mississippi.
Okay. .ms.
Lifeworks, all one word, .ms.
That's right. Kyle
Ruth, Routh.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So you're one of the counselors. There's many others.
Yeah, 2 right now. Your mother-in-law, Denise, and then Jeremy Erickson, who's also he's a CSAT, and then hopefully in the new year we're going to be getting a little bit bigger building and adding a couple more. And I've identified another CSAT that will likely be coming as well. So.
Wow. And I love that you're right across the street right now from us.
Yes.
That makes it super convenient, because often I'll tell people when I'm counseling them, listen, I know of a group, they're right across the street if you want me to refer you.
Right.
So that's always a possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the new office will be just down Getwell. So half a mile from here instead of 300 yards.
Yeah.
I guess that's twice the distance,
Oh,
right?
that's great. So it's right in South Haven, a good Christian organization. And, you guys add your faith to what you're doing. And I know, like, my mother-in-law, she's an LCSW, licensed clinical social worker, and you're an
PC.
I keep getting that. I'm stuttering on it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think that the answer that you've given, what can we do, community, is the best answer that anybody could give. So, Kyle, I'm so appreciative of you giving this hour to just talk with me about this. My prayer is that God would use it in someone's life who listens to this. People listen to this podcast, not a lot, a few. Yeah. And those who do listen, maybe there's somebody out there struggling who has been embarrassed to talk about this. They didn't know where to go. We've opened the door from a Christian vantage point and said, hey, here's a professional. Let's talk about this. And maybe the Lord will use it to bring them into a community or to bring them to a counselor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely my hope, right? I went into counseling after being a youth director for several years, and felt my gift set in my one-on-one or small group kind of ministry, not to the masses, right? But would definitely invite anybody who needed a listening ear to contact us, and we'll walk with you through this.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kyle, and thanks for being on Footnotes. And with that, we'll end, and we appreciate you listening.